part of our policing session beyond defunding, but that really is just a sort of a general way to talk about some of the issues that have been on the nation's calendar for the past 6 months. Some of them controversial, some of them uh, not so controversial, but equally important. The main thrust here, what we want to talk about, I think, is how, if at all, we want to change the mission of policing. If we want to redefine policing or reinvent policing, what exactly do we mean by that? And I'd like to start off with Richard Aborn, who is president of the Citizens Crime Commission of New York City, and which has been instrumental in passing a lot of the legislation we were talking about, kind of reform legislation in the state of New York that we have been talking about during the day, expanding the use of DNA evidence to convict the guilty, exonerating the innocent, gun violence reduction, which Richard has been very much involved in his career. But his commission recently put out a report, which I found very intriguing and really worth discussing in detail, insofar as we can today, which is really, to put it in a captive phrase, changing the mission to one of force to one of service. So, Richard, why don't you explain a bit what you meant by that and where you think it should go?
Sure, Steve. First of all, thank you so much for not only sponsoring this forum, but also inviting me to participate. I really appreciate it. It's a great audience to be discussing these rather complex, complicated issues with. It comes as no shock to anyone that the United States is in the middle of a very robust discussion around both criminal justice reform and police reform. At the criminal justice level, we're looking at questions like when is jail appropriate, when is prison appropriate, when is bail appropriate, etc. And in the policing space, having a good, important discussion about what it is we want from our police, what functions we want our police to have, what do we not want them doing, how do we reduce aggressiveness, bias, etc., increase transparency and legitimacy. And something is going to emerge from that conversation. It won't be the police agencies that we see now, but we will still have police post that conversation. And it's post that conversation that I'm actually concerned about. And I'm concerned about it because we have been having this discussion in the United States about police department misbehavior, if you will, to use an all-encompassing phrase, for probably 20, 30 years. And if you look back in history, back to the founding of policing, we have a long, long history in the US about police over-aggressiveness, issues of bias, systemic racism, etc. So in my mind, whatever emerges from the what do we want from our police discussion, the current discussion, should be something that doesn't border on reform, but rather tackles a much bigger question about how you change the culture of policing. And the reason I suggest that is that society is replete with efforts to try and change behavior by legislation, and frankly, it often doesn't work. And I think the culture of policing in the United States is now so entrenched in what is essentially almost an 18th century, if not 19th century model, that it's time to rethink that. So what we had proposed is shifting from the American model of police forces to a new American model of police services. Now, what does that mean? In a police service, police would still patrol the streets, they'd still wear uniforms, some would still have guns, there will still be violence, they would still make arrests, they'd still do apprehensions, but you would begin to change the composition of the police in a dramatic way. And one of the ways you would do that would be by embracing the ethos that the community is a real partner in the fight against crime. This is not just about establishing better relationships with the community. This is about establishing real, genuine partnerships with the community. And I mean literally having them at the table as you start thinking about crime reduction in different neighborhoods. You would also begin to shift the people that you begin to recruit into a policing agency so that we didn't recruit just enforcers as we do now, but we rather recruited people with a much broader skill set. So for sure, we'll continue to bring in some people that are enforcement oriented. But I'd like to see us start infusing the policing agency, or in my world, a police service, with people that have various skills that allow us to broaden our purview about how we go about crime reduction, which, by the way, and I'll mention this in a bit, would have collateral and beneficial impact on some of the issues that we're facing today. So what would that look like? I would start looking for people that understand how to build community relationships, in other words, community organizing skills. I would look for people that have mental health skills. How do you work with a mental health population? I would look for people that understand the intersection between urban architecture and crime reduction. Well known, but we don't practice it in any systemic way. I would look for social workers who can have a huge impact on some of these issues, et cetera, et cetera. I would continue to build out that skill set so that eventually, while we had enforcers, we also had equal numbers of people with these various skill sets so that police leaders, police commanders could think about crime reduction in much broader, much less aggressive ways. I would also start pushing police departments, police services into the prevention field much more proactively in this way. We all know from years of study that many of the drivers of crime are embedded in deep sociological phenomenon that are the results of years and years and years of very bad policies, things that we have not addressed, we haven't even come to grips with yet. And that's going to be a very tough conversation in the US, and it's one we need to have. However, we also know that there are drivers of crime that are susceptible to immediate mitigation, where you can bring in short-term resources and have a positive impact on crime. For instance, at the Crime Commission, we do an enormous amount of work in the high-risk gang space and with gun trafficking. We know in the gang space that there's a lot of homelessness, couch surfing in New York terms. There's a lot of food insecurity. There's a lot of deep trauma, both individual and group trauma. We know that. Why not bring the resources in to start addressing those issues? And the police department, which obviously has probably the most nuanced view into these communities because of the work it does, whether we like that or not. They are there every day. They are there talking with people both overtly and covertly. They have an understanding of what's going on. They could easily act as a liaison to city agencies to bring a lot of those much needed short-term mitigating factors in to try and reduce some of the violence that is taking place. However, you need personnel that's going to recognize that, and you need a culture that's going to be charged with recognizing those sorts of issues. So you begin to change the focus of the police department from one of just apprehension, just arrest, just violence control to a much broader purview. But you can't do that and just talk about it. You have to back up what you're going to do by the way you change your culture, your internal culture. And those who have been in and around policing, and I have been now for a number of years, both in the United States, in Europe, and in Latin America, know that the single best way to change a policing culture, the culture itself, is by what you measure. Jack Maple, the very famous transit lieutenant who became probably the principal driving force of NYPD's strategy in the mid-1990s and who created the CompStat process, is well known for the phrase, inspect what you expect. Inspect what you expect. If you inspect the number of tickets, the number of arrests, the number of summonses, you're going to get tickets, summonses, and arrests. But if you measure those things, plus you measure resolution of issues in your neighborhood, joint community plans with neighborhood, conflict resolution, the delivery of prevention skills, well-developed plans to develop partnerships with neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and bringing the right skill set, and the list becomes endless. And then you infuse those metrics into CompStat, which is the best way to manage a police department, hold people accountable, but also act as a tutorial. You could begin to develop some real change in an agency over time. This is not a magic bullet. This is not going to happen overnight. If we're looking for the overnight fix, better go look for something else. There's no overnight fix here. But that would be a long-term way of beginning to change these agencies. Now, would this be easy? Absolutely not. This would be very complicated. You'd be talking about uprooting 100, 150 years, count whatever you want, of police culture. But is this doable? Absolutely. It's absolutely doable. We're in New York, so I'll point to NYPD. NYPD has already started this neighborhood policing program. Now, it's been upset by COVID, but that was beginning to have some impact, and that was beginning to change the perspective of the department. And interestingly enough, cops were knocking down the door to join the neighborhood policing program, completely contrary to all predictions. And that really tells us.
Tell us what that is, Richard. The neighborhood.
I'm sorry, neighborhood policing is a new methodology being tried by the NYPD, where officers are taken off standard patrols and charged with getting into neighborhoods. And I'll explain why we say neighborhoods. Getting into neighborhoods, getting to know people there, beginning to understand what the issues are of most concern to those neighborhoods, and then developing joint remedial programs to mitigate whatever those issues are. The reason it's been called the neighborhood policing program, because in New York terms, we have communities, which are, these are all vague terms, but somewhat larger geographic units. We think of neighborhoods as smaller geographic units. These are not political legal terms. They're conceptual terms. So neighborhood policing is actually a very good start, and it is part of what a police service would be. But I don't underestimate the difficulty of this. But when I urge departments to think about this, and we just launched this program, and we're actually getting some interesting response. I say repeatedly, of course you have to have political support. This is going to require very bold political leadership. You have to have police commissioner or police chief support, but you also have to have internal support. Legitimacy is both an external desire and an internal desire. Internal legitimacy is as important as external legitimacy. So you have to have your cops, your rank and file, and your union members. And to me, one of the most important aspects of bringing about change is getting your sergeants and lieutenants on board. I think sergeants and lieutenants are one of the fastest ways possible to change actions in a police agency. And the reason I say that, it's because it is those sergeants and lieutenants who actually have the greatest influence over police behavior, because they can do all the modeling. They are with those police officers day in and day out, and in fact, come right out of police officer ranks. So you've got to get your sergeants and lieutenants on board, and you're, of course, going to have to work with the unions. And everybody's saying to me, the unions will never reject this. I'm not so sure that's right. This does not threaten union power. In theory, it increases union membership. It doesn't diminish any of their base. So I'm not so sure that they would axiomatically be against it. They understand that there are issues of thought. And then I would use that same process to obviously reach deeply into the community. If we don't get this police community thing right, we're just going to be struggling with this forever. So our proposal is, frankly, to think big, think boldly, transform this crisis. This is a crisis in every sense of the word, and seize as an opportunity to start doing some big change. And I think that one of the big changes is, post the discussion of what we want from our police, would be to shift the resulting entity from a police force into a police service and start to do all the work necessary to accomplish that.
So translate that into policy, Richard. I mean, is it achievable through legislation, like the kind of reform legislation we're seeing now in New Jersey and Massachusetts, for instance? Is it at the level of training, or is it at the level, as you're talking about, just at the precinct level, where sergeants, who are the key figures in any training of young recruits, are the ones who make the change or don't make the change?
If I may, yes, yes, and yes. So obviously you would not do this at the national level. Policing in the United States is a local phenomenon, but a city council could mandate that recruitment goals be changed. A mayor could mandate that recruitment goals be changed and that different types of personnel be recruited. Certainly a police commissioner would have the ability to alter the recruiting. A mayor and a city council could mandate, to me, that's not the best way to do it, but a mayor or city council could mandate a change in the metrics and direct a policing agency to collect different kinds or additional kinds of metrics. You absolutely could do that. You could make it requirements on sergeants and lieutenants to be measuring these sorts of things and to conduct evaluations that are not just quantitative, but are also qualitative. So yes, you could use some legislative mandates. Frankly, to me, the best way to do it would be through a cooperative collective effort if we can achieve that. But if you can't achieve that, yeah, you could legislate your way to a lot of this.
Well, I want to move now to Sergeant Montague. We published this week in the Crown Report a story that was both disturbing and inspiring to me. We looked exclusively at Black officers, and we found that, for over 30 years or more, Black officers have been caught in the middle between community protests and their inability and their they're feeling that their powerlessness inside their own forces. We saw some of the data that Professor Johnson showed us earlier today about the percentage of Black and Brown police officers in agencies around the country. You are the president of Black Shield Police Association in Cleveland, which also touches on the issue of police unions and the role of police unions. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, the uncomfortable position that Black police officers are placed in, and one of the things you mentioned, we mentioned in the article, was how they're really key to some of the reforms you want to see. If they're not on side, then the community is not going to be on side. So, Vincent, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me on the program today. And you're absolutely right. It is a difficult subject to embark upon, discussing being a police officer that as African American on a police force where, like in Cleveland, 23% of the officers are African American out of 1,600. So we are the minority in a city where the majority in the city are African Americans. So we do have difficulties having a voice in the unions because we are the minority. So it does make it difficult to have that voice. Like if you don't agree with policy or you want to voice your opinion on changes in the contract, we don't have anyone to represent us or to listen to our voice that's part of that executive board. So that's why the Black Shield comes into place to kind of give that balance with the department and learning, like going through like the George Floyd incident. It was very difficult being an African American and then also being a police officer at the same time, because you understand what your role is as a police officer because you're on the streets every day. You're going to those homicides. You're working with the community. You're going to the home of someone's house that just got broken into. Like you're dealing with that. But also when it comes to social justice and civil rights issues, and those things are very touching because we have a history of it. And I can speak for history of my family that my grandparents shared with me. That history is real, and so you have empathy for the community as well. So the tension comes into play when you have people that you work with that don't understand that history. They don't understand what the community is going through, and it does cause some tension within the department. So ultimately, we try to work together, and we have to put those differences aside. So I think recruitment and understanding different people's biases is an important part of policing, because I've experienced it where you don't understand why. But when I first started the job and I was new, and I was working with officers that were Caucasian men, and things that when they made an arrest, and the reason why it made me feel uncomfortable at times, because I'm like, this is why I was pulled over, or this is the reason why I was stopped when I was a teenager. And then so then you kind of understand the community, like, hey, because he has a man, you get an officer that says, well, I see this guy, he has he's driving a nice car. What is he doing in this neighborhood? Like, why is he driving this car over here? And then they find a reason to pull him over. And so when I was 18, I felt like I got pulled over for that. And so you kind of have empathy for the community when they say these things. And so I think as a police officer now, I think sometimes we ignore what the community is saying, and we don't take it seriously, but some of their concerns are real. And when they were saying defund the police, I think officers took real offense to that. And as far as being in the police department, they were like, oh, well, they just want to get rid of the police. And I don't think they were really listening to what they were saying. They were just saying they wanted change. And so I think as officers in the culture, we take offense to when we're criticized, when we're told that ways that we can improve our performance. It's not personal. We serve the community, and we have to listen to what the community says, what they're telling us, because ultimately, just because I work in an urban area doesn't mean I can't serve that community as if I was working in a more affluent area. They should get the same service. So they shouldn't be treated differently. They shouldn't be treated because they're in poverty, treated differently. So I would say within that, after the job really slowed down to me within that first 5 years, I really started changing the way I policed, and it was more effective. So you see the use of forces for individuals. As far as me, I haven't had a use of force in, it's been like maybe 10 years. And you engage with the community more. You able to solve more crimes. You gain more community relationships than just me being a police officer. I'm concerned more about serving, and I'm not that guy now that being African American, you're telling people to slow down now. So if you're working with, I remember working with a guy that was a Caucasian male, and he saw a car, and he was like, they're looking weird. I'm like, what happened? They just looked at me funny. The car took off, and I'm like, slow down. What crime did they commit? But it takes for people to make that stand as a police officer to say, hey, this isn't right. What's the probable cause? And if you have people going along with something that's wrong, and then the culture will never change. So I think it starts from up top to them bringing that information down, and the chief and the command staff giving those expectations to the sergeants, to the patrol officers of what they expect and how we should treat the community. And then also, I think we have to change the way of what we describe as a good police officer. I think also being a good police officer is not necessarily getting guns and drugs off the street. What about those officers that you don't hear about that bought groceries for someone because they didn't have food on the table? What about those officers that bought a kid a new bike? That's also good police service. You give a person a warning ticket. So I think letting the public know that what a good police officer is not necessarily getting drugs and guns off the street. Policing as a general is a service, and we have to focus on not just the policing that we see on TV shows, but policing as a general, as a whole. I think if we work together with the community to make those changes, it's possible. And being an African American on the police department, it is a struggle being a minority. But if I wasn't here, if we didn't have African Americans on the police department, there would not be any diversity. And I think that we have to start recruiting more to get more African Americans, to change the mindset, to get them into policing. But once you change the culture of what a police officer is, I think that will also help get more African Americans on the police force.
Let me unpack that a bit. This goes to the core of what we were talking about in the last session. How do you make policing attractive to an African American young man or young woman who's looking for a good career? I mean, what drew you into policing, for instance, as opposed to say becoming a stockbroker or a soldier or adventurer or whatever else? I mean, why did you join the force?
And the reason why I joined the force is because after graduating from college, I went to a Tuskegee University, which is a historically Black college and university. And I was in a spot where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I wanted to go in law enforcement, or did I want to go further into the legal realm? I wasn't sure. And I had a conversation with this guy, Clark Kellogg. He's a retired Cleveland police officer now. And he actually told me a lot about the benefits, because my mindset going to policing was like, I don't want to get shot. I don't want to get killed. It's dangerous. And to be an officer in Cleveland, no, I can't do that. And then also I thought it wasn't a job for me, because my mindset was that this was a job, like a family job. Like you had to be, I didn't have the right complexion or I didn't have the right name to be a police officer. But once I talked to him, I found out that police officers, you're able to support a family. You have good benefits, and that the service part, because I was doing a lot of community service. So I was like, I probably would be a good fit. And so when I'm reaching out to people that are African American, and letting them know about recruiting them to be police officers, I think it's effective because they don't want to run the streets and make all these arrests and all that. That's not what might attract them to policing. But from my experiences, and letting them know why I became a police officer, I think that is beneficial. So yeah, that's why.
I want to go back to that, but let me move to Steve Fletcher for a second. Well, Minneapolis was one of the first cities, if not the first city, to really take seriously the whole notion of defunding and define it differently. Define it as a way of diverting parts of the police budget to non-police issues, some of them related to public safety. But then it backtracked. At least it's seen that it's backtracked. And Steve Fletcher is a council member in Minneapolis and vice president or vice chair of the Public Safety Committee in Minneapolis, has been one of the architects, I guess, of the whole, if I can call it that, the defunding notion, and it's since gone back. So if you can give us an account, Steve, of what happened and whether you're happy with it, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me, and thanks to everybody on the panel for this really important discussion. I'm going to share my screen a little bit just to provide a little bit of context, because I think, it has been an odd experience to be in the global spotlight the way that we are. And, I think it's worth acknowledging that context and then talking about how it's actually played out. Let's see, is everybody seeing the image of George Floyd?
Yes.
Okay. So first, I just want to acknowledge what put us in the spotlight, which is that one of our officers wearing a Minneapolis uniform put his knee on George Floyd's neck. And everybody has seen that video. Everybody around the world has been shocked by it. And for all of us who feel responsible for funding, for approving the activities of this police force, we feel very accountable for the kind of violence that's done on our behalf. And this was shocking. This was a terrible tragedy, and I think it's important for us to take accountability for it as participants in a system that produces this kind of outcome. And so people, I think rightly, were shocked and were calling on us to create change. And many of us rose to that occasion. And I just want to say that part of that call was not a result of that incident alone, although that should have been enough and would have been enough. But we had, as a community, already been through a controversial police shooting, and I think eminently avoidable police shooting in Jamar Clark, where the community had risen up and blocked, barricaded the 4th precinct and occupied the 4th precinct for a long period of time. And so when I came into office, and then we had the shooting of Justine Damond in 2017, 2017. And so when I came into office, people were already talking about this, and we had actually, a lot of people who are saying we need to take some responsibility for the violence that's being done in our uniforms, and we need to start thinking about how to produce different outcomes. And I just want to say we are a poster child for reform in many ways. We have body cams, and we actually have very high body cam compliance. We do de-escalation trainings and anti-bias trainings, and a lot of the things that people put forward as here are the ways to fix policing. We do all that. We've been doing all that. And so I think, in many ways, Minneapolis was thought of as a very progressive place, and we're just seeing that those reforms are not taking shape. And so I think the analysis that has really emerged in the city of Minneapolis is one that says we need to take responsibility for what we send authorized force and authorized violence to becomes the response of default, because we don't really know who else is going to do it, right? So a situation comes up, somebody calls 911, they have an emergency, and if we haven't thought of some other kind of response, MPD is sort of that's who goes if we don't know who to send. And sending people with guns and the authorization to use force to a whole huge variety of situations is actually not very responsible behavior. And that's not on police, that's on us, that we're responding to these situations that way. And so especially as, a lot of the defunding of services all over the country for the last several decades has happened around mental health, around public housing, around all kinds of things that has led to more response to homelessness, to addiction, to mental health, to all kinds of things. We've been just putting more and more on MPD's plate as the 911 calls roll in. And that's led to a steady increase in policing in our police budget. And so the community was calling on us to change things. We've really been talking about how can we not send the use of force to as many things? How can we respond differently in a way that'll produce better outcomes to a bunch of the calls that come in? And so in 2018, we set up a 911 study group that was really designed to go through all of the call codes in 911 and start to look at what is the work that would be better done by other kinds of professionals. This was slow work, it was methodical work, but it was intentional about taking seriously, and this is all before George Floyd was killed. It was intentional about taking seriously the question of how can we be doing this work better and providing alternatives to public safety, beyond policing. George Floyd was killed, and that really called on us to accelerate the work. I think we weren't moving with the level of urgency that the moment called for, and that the community was calling for. And so as we saw, this is the picture that everybody has seen of Minneapolis. That's sort of the famous distillation of a lot of the work. There's me and several of my colleagues on stage in front of a sign that was set up by activists. That's not ever a slogan that we would have necessarily chosen. We tended to talk about transforming our system of public safety, reimagining public safety, more aspirational verbs, but that is the picture. And especially during COVID, there practically hasn't been another photo op. So the paper's just going to keep using this picture and this picture and this picture. I think that's going to be the image that is burned in everybody's brain. So whether we like defund as a slogan or don't like defund as a slogan, we're certainly talking about reallocating funding in a way that relates to that. And we're certainly going to live with the slogan because that is the image that's burned into everybody's brains. But I do want to just emphasize, a lot of people saw this and thought, oh my God, they defunded their police. They abolished the cops. They don't have police in Minneapolis, or whatever the case may be. And that's not an especially accurate thing. And in fact, when you look at our budget trajectory, you'll see that there is still, as we look at 2020, this is from our open data portal, so anybody can go look this up. There is still not a year where we have actually cut the police budget. We have slowed the pace of growth, but we have not actually made cuts. And I think that's a really important thing for people to note when you kind of understand the political context. And I'll say my critics would be very surprised to hear this, because I would say even a lot of residents in Minneapolis are quite convinced that we made major cuts to policing. And in fact, it's very, very hard to build the political will to do even very small incremental shifts. So what you'll see in, I was elected in 2017, so 2018 was the first budget that I worked on, and you'll see that in 2018, there was some budget growth. We ended up taking a lot of heat for cutting $1.1 million of proposed growth. The mayor had proposed to grow the force by an additional 8 officers. And we used that money to fund a lot of the alternative programming, to create the Office of Violence Prevention and sustainably fund it, to invest in some very targeted programs like a domestic violence program that the city attorney was operating, and some other things that we knew were very specific to producing outcomes that we wanted that could reduce people's exposure to policing. 2019 was a very similar thing. I've been the person kind of leading proposed budget cuts, and often found it hard to pull together 7 votes, even on fairly progressive council to intervene much in the budget. And then, you know, the 2020 budget, you also see actually a little bit of growth, and frankly, you're going to see that curve be a little bit steeper because they went over budget on overtime, and we have to pay the overtime. So what ends up happening is if we don't have a mayor who's holding a chief accountable for staying within budget, we actually can't really even cut the budget because they'll just run way over on overtime and end up using the money anyway. So so that's some kind of context on how this has been working, is that there's been a push-pull. We have held the line on several things. We have made some cuts, but often it has not been nearly as dramatic as what people would have said. And I think the real achievement of Minneapolis is probably not measured in cuts or measured in how much did we defund, because as you can see in the chart, that wouldn't necessarily be a story to tell. It's not a very interesting story. But in what did we fund and what did we win? Now, I just want to note too that there's another story about Minneapolis that gets told sometimes, which is about runaway crime because of the cuts that we made. Now, I think there's a perception that the cuts are deeper, and part of that is because following the murder of George Floyd and the unrest that followed, there has been massive attrition in the department. None of that was something we budgeted for, but over 150 officers have gone on extended leave or retired. And so we are right now significantly shorter staffed than what we have budgeted for. And a lot of people have assumed that that was some sort of council action. And in fact, that was nothing that we did. That was a set of personnel decisions that individual officers made. And so we are seeing what it would look like to operate with fewer police in our city. And one thing that I'll just note is I get a lot of calls that are like, what are you going to do about runaway crime? And as you look at that line there, you do see that we actually had a really tough summer. The combination of COVID, which drove crime in cities all over the country, and I think a lot of pain and anguish and a lot of complicated feelings that people had about the killing of George Floyd and about this conversation around policing that was happening. We saw crime go up. We've also seen it trending steadily down since about August. That things are trending in the right direction, and overall, as much as everybody's described it as some sort of really out of control crime wave, we saw about a 6% increase in Part 1 crimes over the previous year. Still not good. I never want to see an increase, but I also don't want to characterize this as some sort of, the city's on fire and everything's awful sort of story, which is one of the stories that often gets told about us, lately. But the context of an increase in crime has certainly created a moment where there's political backlash. So when we were standing on that stage in Powderhorn Park, I think in that moment, most people were very focused on the tragedy of George Floyd's killing and wanted to see change, and were really committed to that and supportive of it. I think, 6 months later, after sitting alone in their apartments during COVID, watching Citizen App and absorbing social media and seeing crime rates go up, I think a lot of people got into their fear and started to really worry about what change would look like, and are less sure about what kind of change they're willing to support. So the political dynamic certainly shifts over time, and I think right now you would hear a very mixed story from people in Minneapolis about what they want to do. I wouldn't necessarily say it's backsliding, but I think the division on the council in terms of what we're able to do and what we're willing to do is probably reflective of our constituents who are wrestling with this and trying to figure it out. And there's not really a consensus in any case. Now, in this most recent budget, it was a high profile thing to say that we made some cuts. And in fact, this is a graphic that was generated by one of the activist groups sort of claiming a victory for their advocacy. And by the way, advocates put together a really beautiful people's budget that included a much broader set of reforms or suggested investments that we could make if we were to make deeper cuts in policing. And a lot of those investments really are things that we should be considering in terms of housing and healthcare and so on. But here's the things that we actually did. Several of us came forward with a safety for all budget was what we called it, and it featured $8 million in cuts. And those cuts were used to fund a mobile mental health team, $2 million for the Office of Violence Prevention. So that office has really grown to a place now where we've got it fully staffed and it's operating as a real office that can actually be expected to do things instead of like two staffers holding it together with duct tape. We're shifting report-only calls to 311. So now when you call to report a theft that occurred in the past and there's no present danger that requires an armed response, we can take that report for you and initiate, insurance claims and that kind of thing. It cut 22 MPD positions that are not officers. So we had a group of crime prevention specialists who we think would be better supported and be able to produce better outcomes that are more aligned with city values if they're in the neighborhood and community relations department, focused on a broader community safety approach. And then we did cut funding for the mounted patrol after sort of repeated abuse of mounted patrol and crowd control situations that made people really scared. Now, even this $8 million cut, which is a very small percentage of the budget, in the final vote, $5 million of it was backfilled in one-time money. So the total change that we made in terms of defund, again, was probably not very sexy. I voted against that, but I was just overridden by my colleagues. So we sort of hit the limit of where the majority of the council was willing to go. But we did fund a mobile mental health program. So mental health calls, by and large, that come into 911 are going to be responded to by mental health professionals. To me, that's a massive improvement and significant infrastructure that we're rolling out that I think can make a big difference. The same with report-only calls. So I think we're building infrastructure towards a system that relies less heavily on armed law enforcement. And we're running up against a lot of the practical, political, and structural limits of that work. One of the things that we are working to do is to change the charter of our city. Our charter gives policy authority over the police department, unlike all the other departments where we have legislative authority and the mayor has executive authority. Our charter gives complete authority to the mayor over the police department. And so we're, as a council, very limited in our ability to participate in any kind of policy conversations. Part of why we are always talking about the budget and why this looks like a defund movement as opposed to a broader transformational movement is that we actually aren't allowed in the policy conversations by our charter. So we're putting something on the ballot to allow residents to change that so that hopefully we can have a broader public conversation that's more accountable and transparent about how police policy is established. We'll continue forward with this work. In the meantime, we're also under a pattern and practices investigation by the State Department of Human Rights that I think is going to produce some significant policy changes that I think we'll probably enthusiastically agree to, but we might not have the choice if we didn't like them. I think we're going to agree to them either way. And the mayor and the chief continue to make policy reforms along the way as well. So there's going to continue to be work in this area, and I think honestly this next election with the charter amendment and all 13 of us and the mayor on the ballot is going to be an opportunity for the city to really express itself about sort of where we currently are. In the meantime, we're all preparing for Derek Chauvin's trial, and we're going to be in the spotlight again, and I'm hopeful that we can produce a much less dramatic story for you all to watch remotely. Stephen, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So let me ask a policy question here about the principle that the thinking that went into the idea of the cuts, even though, as you say, the initial round of cutting was reduced, was backfilled. Was the idea that you needed to cut the Minneapolis police services because you felt the city was over-policed, or because the services that you wanted to divert the money to were underfunded and you needed to fund them? And what was the is it thinking more of an ideological approach to policing, or was it just a practical approach saying we just don't have the money to fund everything we want to, so we're spending too much now on policing issues, let's turn it in a different direction?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's probably several things involved for me, at least. I can't speak for all of my colleagues about why we kind of did what we did, but from my perspective, and I can stop sharing my screen here so we can get back into conversation. If I can figure out how to do that, hang on.
You can say stop sharing somewhere.
Yeah, I would think so. I'm not seeing that button, but
But you can do it. Anyway, keep going.
all right. Oh, there it is. All right, good. Hi, everybody. So I think there's several things behind it. I do think in many cases we are funding the police to do activities that we don't want them to be doing, right? And so we need to sort of own that. And if we're saying we're going to take these things off your plate, it makes sense that we would be cutting budget. We would do that in any other department. If we told Public Works, stop sweeping these streets, we would probably cut their street sweeping budget. So it's partially that. It's partially that, yes, the funding for alternative programs is going to have to come from somewhere, right? If we're going to fund a mental health response, we have to find the money for that. And, currently policing is about a third of our general fund money. So it's really hard to figure out where would we find the money without looking at the police budget. If the police budget is sacred and cannot be cut, just politically or otherwise, then I'm not sure how we would ever fund alternatives. I think we'd run into some very practical problems. But I think maybe there's even a third thing that people think about less, which is, especially for us as a council that is, our only power is the power of the purse. I think when we see a lack of accountability, we don't see the discipline happening when officers are misusing their power. We call for change publicly. We have given staff directions in the past asking for change, which are really requests because we don't have, that kind of official authority. But when we see year after year, nothing getting better, different mayors, different chiefs, but nothing's improving. And when you look at that, part of it is if the council is calling for change and the public's calling for change, but at the end of the day, we never produce any consequences and we'll never, ever cut your budget because we're politically afraid to do it. So there's never a consequence for you just ignoring the public and going about it. Why would you change? Why would the Police Federation ever agree to any changes if we can't put any kind of cuts on the table? If we're not willing to create any consequences? And that's the consequence that we have available to us. And so for me, I think there has to be something on the table that says, if you're continuing to produce results that we can't live with morally, we're not going to fund that. And I don't know if that's going to produce any change. I'm not sure if reform is possible. I'm kind of increasingly in the camp that we need to shrink our armed law enforcement response because I'm not sure it can be reformed, but certainly it can't be reformed if there's never a consequence for ignoring it.
Well, hold that thought. Let me go to Professor Vitale, who has a very different idea of the future of policing. So perhaps even he would go even a bit further than what Steve would go. Professor Vitale?
Thank you, Stephen. I just want to say what a pleasant surprise it was to get the invitation. I've followed the work of the symposium for many years, and it's very exciting to see some of these ideas begin to be discussed in this forum. So look, I want to take on Richard's proposal. I think it is the wrong way to go. I think it's completely the opposite of what the movement for Black Lives that we witnessed this summer is calling for. And I'll tell a little story that speaks to that and to some of the comments from Sergeant Montague. So before COVID, I was down in Houston giving a talk. I've been giving talks on a daily basis the last 3-4 years around the country and internationally about these issues. And some Black and Latino police officers came to my talk, which does happen. You might be surprised how often. And they asked me during the Q&A, they said, look, we grew up in neighborhoods where policing was a real problem, where we were mistreated, where there was racism, and also where there were very few jobs for us. And the police department was hiring with good wages and benefits, as Sergeant Montague pointed out. And we thought that we could go into policing and change the culture of policing. And these guys were here at my talk at the end of their careers, and they said, we didn't change anything. It was a complete failure. And they said, we thought maybe you could tell us how to change the culture of policing. We're desperate for ideas. And I said, I'm sorry, there's no changing the culture of policing. When our elected officials make the decision to use violence workers to wage a war on drugs, a war on crime, a war on gangs, a war on disorder, a war on terror, and to be in charge of mental health services and homelessness and school discipline, that is going to create massive culture problems in policing. And this is going to have deleterious effects on those that are policed. So they hung out afterwards and we talked. And they're struggling with this because they've devoted their lives to law enforcement. And I said, look, at the time that you were thinking about going into policing, if you'd had a choice between two jobs with the same pay and benefits, one as a police officer and one working in a community center in your own neighborhood, coaching football, mentoring young people, working with trauma counselors, which of these jobs would you have chosen? And they all laughed. It's Texas. They were like, we would all much rather have been working in our own communities with our young people. But there were no jobs like that. And I said, exactly. Why are there never any jobs like that? Never. The very few jobs that exist don't pay nearly as well as what a police officer makes. And they rarely exist. And this is the point. Now, Richard says, look, we're going to change the culture of policing and we're going to expand the vision of what policing is because police, quote here, have the most nuanced view of the community. But this is just patently false. Police officers do not live in these communities. In fact, we have a policy against them living in the communities that they police for good reasons, to avoid corruption and other kinds of problems. The people who live in the community know best. These neighborhoods are filled with community-based organizations who have a much more nuanced view of what the community needs. But we continue to defund them in favor of funding violence workers. I've worked for years with my friend Talon Murphy Sr., who is a violence worker in West Harlem, who spent years overseeing efforts to reduce violence in public housing projects with tremendous success. Police are part of the problem, not part of the solution in that work. We need to shift as many resources as we possibly can out of violence work and into actual community-based strategies. We have plenty of evidence about how to do this. We need to get them out of the mental health business, out of the homelessness business, out of the sex work business, out of the school discipline business, out of the drug business, out of the youth gang business. And it turns out that that is the vast majority of what police actually do every day. In addition to doing things like taking reports for insurance, as Steve pointed out, that there's no need to use uniformed armed police to do this work. So the movement for Black Lives is not calling for the police department to hire more social workers. If we need more social workers, let's just hire more social workers. Let's create community workers. Let's create community-based public health institutions and public safety institutions. Let's create family support centers. Let's create mediation centers. It turns out that when we do this, the results are generally very good, despite the fact that these people are paid a tiny, tiny fraction of what police are paid. And in the aggregate, we make a big deal because we started a community-based program and we gave them a couple $1 million when we spend $11 billion a year in New York City on policing. If we put anywhere near those kinds of resources into the kinds of community-based interventions that people are demanding or begging for, we could have substantial improvements in public safety without all the collateral consequences that inevitably come from assigning violence workers to these tasks, regardless of the race, background, public, mindset, attitude of the individual officers. Because the job demands a mindset in order to be successful at it. We have a lot of research that shows this, that at the best, we can tinker with these reforms and get a little 3% improvement here or a little tiny improvement here. I'm with Steve. I've been looking at policing for 30 years in a variety of capacities, and I am deeply pessimistic about these reform efforts. The officers present and involved in the killing of George Floyd had implicit bias training and de-escalation training and mindfulness training, and were wearing body cameras and had a new use of force policy, and it just didn't make any difference. And that's been the conclusion of the movement for Black Lives. We were told in the wake of the killing of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and so many others that policing was going to get fixed. That was over 6 years ago, and nothing has changed. No one who saw the way the police handled the protests this summer can credibly say that there has been any reform to policing. So we need not to disappear all police tomorrow. This is a canard that's used to undermine this movement. This is about looking systematically at the specific functions that have been turned over to policing and creating evidence-based practices to begin to replace those functions, to evaluate the success of those interventions, to have a spirit of experimentation, and to assess the results and move forward one step at a time. And I think what we get at the end of that is a dramatically smaller footprint for policing, safer communities, and a reduction in the profound racial tensions in American society.
So, thank you, Alex. So just to clarify one definitional point to you, when you say violence workers, which is what I assume you mean by police, what do you mean? Do you mean people who are armed, or people who are violence intervention workers, or
No,
what is the
I
role
mean
of
police officers. I mean police. So look, what distinguishes a police officer from all other parts of city government is their authorization and capacity to use violence. That is the basis of police authority. And what we have to ask in every possible circumstance is what value is added from assigning a violence worker. And my view is that violence work is inherently risky. It's risky to democracy. We need only look at the world around the world to see the role of police forces and military police in undermining democracies around the world. They are inherently at risk of committing violence. They should always, always be understood as the tool of absolute last resort. When everything else has failed, then perhaps we need the intervention of a violence worker. But we've done exactly the opposite. We've turned every social problem under the sun over to the police to solve, and this has come with tremendous collateral consequences that are the root of the demand of, the Black Lives Matter movement.
So, Richard, let me push the ball to your court. How would you respond?
So, one point of clarification, and I guess one overarching question. When I said police have the most nuanced view of a community, I meant in the context of city services, that police were city agencies, that police are in these communities probably more than any other city agency under the most complicated circumstances. They're seeing a lot of the very difficult problems that are presenting to them in 911 calls and other things. So I didn't mean to the exclusion of the community. Outside of that, Alex, I'm not exactly sure where you so vehemently disagree. I do disagree with the term violence workers. Cops are not violence workers. I think that unfairly paints them with a very strong imagery that is unfair to them and only tends to inflame this situation. But other than that, I very clearly said we should have a robust discussion in this country around what we want from our police. Where do we want them operating? And I said, clearly, some services will be moved to other agencies and some will remain with the police, very clearly. I've also said that we shouldn't just have good relationships with communities, but that the community has to be a real partner at the table. They have to be sitting in on the crime fighting strategies. They need to be articulating what they want done in their neighborhood or their community. And when you and you should change the mixture of the police you recruit for 3 reasons. One, it gives you a broader set of tools, as I said, to address these issues. And these issues, as I think you're saying, are conducive to different sorts of amelioration. And police could be the organization that helps bring those resources into the community. It's a more of service, and it's frankly much more effective to think about crime prevention as opposed to crime enforcement. But the knock-on effects are really important. And the knock-on effects are sort of what our council member was starting to allude to before, because I understand this notion of thinking the reform movement is never going to work. I opened with that. I said, we've been here over and over and over and over again. And that's because we never transform, we just reform. And it's time now to transform. So my hope is you get these various skill sets in there, you mix them in with your normal police that you have now, you begin to change the ethos of what these police agencies, hopefully police services, think about. And what does that do? You begin to reduce aggressiveness because you have a lot more contact with the community. And we know that the more contact we have in a beneficial way, the less tension there is. We also know from the data that as much as you can teach people to understand the notion of implicit bias, and maybe even to recognize it in themselves, a big jump, but maybe, you can't necessarily through teaching, through training, change their behavior. But we know from the data that one of the ways you can change the impact of implicit bias is by having much greater contact between groups. And what I'm talking about would do that as well. One of the reasons, and I've heard this comment from Black officers a lot, and it kind of breaks my heart because so many Black cops go into the business hoping to change the culture, and they find it to be just an irresistible wall, a very difficult wall to break through. But when you start changing the actual metrics, you begin to personify the change. You begin to send the message, these changes are important, and you're going to advance or not advance based on how you perform under these new metrics. So you cannot just do one thing or another. You've got to think of a sweeping set of changes that tie together the whole concept and then just continually drive that through the metrics and through the concept process, in my view, that you use. So to go back to the beginning, you say it's totally the wrong way to go. As I listen to you, maybe, but it's not exactly what I hear you saying. I hear you saying we need a robust discussion around what we want from our police. I agree. But I think I also hear you saying there will be some product left after that. I don't think, as you said, that you're for, let's say, defunding the police, disbanding the police. I don't think you are there. I think you recognize that a organized society will need some sort of enforcement mechanism. It is that which I am focused on. It is that which I want to see us change so that 5 years from now, Steve's not having us back saying, okay, guys, what happened? Nothing changed, which right now could well be.
So we have a lot of questions coming in, but I want to first just bring it over to Vincent to get his take on where he stands on this issue, on this debate.
Well, this is and I want to thank Alex and Richard for their comments as well. And some of the things, being an African American officer, some of what we don't want to really address is the issue of race, and that's a huge issue within the police department. A lot of issues that we face are internally. We don't face issues with the public. Like I have a great relationship with people in the public. I fight people that are officers actually. I deal with racism in the department for most of my career. That's what we deal with. You have disagreements with people that defends police actions. When Tamir Rice, that happened in Cleveland. There were racial incidents, disagreements that we had internally because Black officers didn't agree with the actions of the officer that shot Tamir Rice, but white officers did, and we don't want to address that. that's a real issue in policing. And like Alex said, a lot of officers, a lot of incidents that we deal with that ends with police shootings and killings are misdemeanor crimes. These aren't the felony crimes. These aren't, your guy shooting at you. These are like you stop someone for a tail light, or you're arresting someone for marijuana. Then it turns into a use of force where you end up killing someone. Like these are the issues that we're dealing with. So a lot of the calls that we do get, they are domestic violence. We get calls like that, but we're getting calls like civil issues, like you go to someone's house and someone say they don't live there, and it's a civil issue that you got to deal with civil court with, because it's a landlord-tenant issue. We deal with custody issues a lot. That's a probate court issue. So there's a lot of issues that we're not able to handle, especially with like the mental health issues. So we provide a lot of citizens with resources because we can't handle those issues. So those are the majority of our calls, but then we're ignoring the calls when someone's home got broken into, their car got broken into, they were assaulted, because we're putting a lot of energy. Like when you go to a call with a mental health issue, that could take like 2 or 3 hours, because you have to be calm, you have to de-escalate, you have to, and then now you have someone's house just got broken into, their car got stolen, they got robbed at gunpoint, and you're ignoring those issues because we're dealing with a lot of issues that we can't handle, but we're doing our best to try to handle it. So reform does have to happen. I don't know what it looks like, because I've been doing this for almost 15 years now. But we've been talking about it, but I haven't seen no actions.
So this does get to the heart of it about where the divide, as I see it, really is between Alex and Richard, and with many other people on the area of reform, is that whereas Richard would like to move the policing more to the service end of the spectrum, Alex, and this is huge simplification, would like to get policing out of that area completely. That they shouldn't be even thinking about service. Whereas I think Richard might say that, well, and Vincent too, really, that what we do is a lot of, 80% of what we do is not just intervene in those kind of service calls and mental health calls. But hold that thought. We have a bunch of questions here, so you can answer those in response as well to the questions. Here's one, maybe we should start with, from Cassie Chu, who says, for all of you, do you see any models in any other countries that you think are worth following that we should learn from? I mean, obviously, classically in Britain, nobody wears guns unless they have to, and all the way to the military police that you see in dictatorships in Central Europe or whatever else. I mean, are there other models, or are we, as we always are, alone in the U.S. and trying to find their own path? Alex?
Well, look, the models that I'm interested in are superior ways of producing public safety. So in Portugal, they decriminalized pretty much all drugs, gotten police largely out of the drug business. Voters in Oregon just voted to do the same thing. I think this is a tremendously positive move. In a lot of places, they've shut down the vice units. They've decriminalized sex work. The police are not involved in that anymore. In Europe, they don't put police in schools. They think we're nuts for doing that. They would never put police in charge of school discipline. So there are tons of examples, and my book is full of hundreds of them, of places that have figured out other ways to produce public safety, including looking at cure violence models to reduce shootings in neighborhoods, creating these kinds of demand reduction strategies around gun violence rather than just gun control and gun interdiction. So there's tons of examples out there.
And Richard, in your conception, what would you look for as a model in other countries? You worked in Europe, as you say, and in Latin America.
So I think model is too much for a burden. I don't think there's a perfect model out there. I do think, as Alex just said, we can get police and actually we can get law out of a lot of these areas. When I ran for DA, I was a big proponent of decriminalizing a lot of these activities and infusing a prevention model much more into prosecution. I think the model, again, model is a big word, but the British police system is a service-based system. In fact, in common parlance, one of the most iconic police departments in the world is mistakenly called Scotland Yard, otherwise known as the Met, which are the police of London. The formal name of the Met is the MPS, the Metropolitan Police Service. So the service model goes way back in British history. The British also use, particularly in London, they use neighborhood policing officers who are not regular sworn police officers. They have the sheer task of just interacting with the neighborhood. That's what they do. So that's an interesting model. And that actually comes a little bit close to the neighborhood policing model of the New York City Police Department, albeit those are sworn, those are armed cops, obviously, because they're in the United States.
Here's a question for all of you, like all of you to address, is that whether you can really thoroughly reform or change or transform, whatever verb you use, the police without transforming the rest of the justice system. Ranging the courts, the prosecutions, to probation, all the stuff we were talking about yesterday. Whether that makes any sense to really think of a different kinds of police force without really altering how we look at justice systematically. Steve, let me start with you on that, because you're at the grassroots level in the city council. If you're just looking at police, are you guys also looking at the other parts of your justice system?
Sure, of course. Everything that we experience in this, and every change that any part of the system makes, puts pressure on other parts of the system. And I think sometimes in a good way, right? But other parts of the system then have to adjust. So, if you look at like the way in Minneapolis, the way we were handling livability crimes, was we had a bunch of rules that were almost entirely being enforced against Black people, against poor Black people, around spitting and lurking, things that were kind of just gave an officer an opportunity to have an interaction. We've gotten rid of some of those things, but what we used to do was just drag people to jail, and we would do it on a Friday night so that a lot of the people who we were afraid might make trouble over the weekend would be locked up, and they couldn't afford cash bail, and so they'd get out Monday morning. And that was kind of scandalous, but that's what we used to do 20 years ago. And 5 years ago, we got rid of spitting and lurking as crimes in our ordinances. And that puts pressure on the system then, right? Because the system was oriented towards us providing that input in arrests. And they're looking at recidivism rates and what their sentencing guidelines should be and how all of this stuff should work. And they're having to respond in different ways. And what it's done, I think that's positive, is hopefully get to looking at the reasons that these things are happening, recognizing. So we've started to look at programs then that said, okay, let's break this down. Let's look at who are the people who are constantly coming in and out of court for other stuff, and how do we get them social work? How do we get them mental health services? How do we get them other kinds of things so that we stop having these kinds of recurrences? But those conversations didn't happen until we started saying, we're not going to just lock these folks up anymore. And sometimes that's us saying we're going to stop making these arrests. Sometimes that's the court system saying we're not going to accept them if you bring them here for that.
I think
anymore. We're not booking people. But either way, we can drive reform from each part of the system.
That's
we can push change.
To make, I would think, because we can't really expect police to change if we keep insisting that they prosecute and pursue the same crimes that we ask them to. Unless we change the crimes, we define what crimes we ask them to police.
Yeah. Well, and a good example of that, I mean, we really hit a really challenging pain point on this last summer, because Hennepin County correctly looked at recidivism rates and looked at a really data-driven approach to booking for juveniles, and categorized crimes accordingly. So they won't book juveniles unless there's something that indicates a very high likelihood of recidivism and a very high likelihood of harm. If they don't book them, and that really reduced. I mean, we've cut our juvenile jail population to like 30% of what it was on any given day. I mean, it's really we've made really good progress in that regard. Well, one of the crimes that the data didn't show justified booking was car theft, and I think they're right about the data. I actually don't think that putting those kids through booking and the sort of trauma and experience of being put into the criminal justice system in that way at that age is necessarily the best way to produce a good outcome with them. But we still have this problem of, if we've got kids who are stealing 10, 15, 20 cars in a summer because there's no consequences for them, because they don't see a judge for 16 weeks. And that's like way too abstract to say, like, you got a court date at the end of the summer for a 14-year-old to say, like, oh, I'll stop doing that thing. And so we were having just this like rotating door of people for a crime that does create victims, right? Like, we want to take that seriously. So what we want to do is not suddenly start locking kids up, but we do want to figure out a way to divert kids from stealing lots of cars, right?
Steve,
And figuring that out, I mean, what we ended up doing was getting them expedited court dates, just recognizing that, like, getting them into juvie wasn't the right thing, but that the courts are able to give other kinds of services. They're able to prescribe, you know, here's the social services that you actually need, and a sense of consequence from a quick court appearance. And that was enough to cut the recidivism rate back down for most of those kids. So trying to figure out, how do we fill those gaps without necessarily ramping up the carceral system, I think is the right thing to do. But those pressures are constantly there. Every time one of us changes our policy, everybody else has to adjust.
If I can, to your question, Steve, these front end filters that Steve just talked about are really important. I think we need to think a lot about who goes into the system, but we also need to think about what happens when someone does go into the system, because there are going to be people going into the system. And I think there are three things that are vital that have to be done to change some of the violence in the country. One is the speed of adjudication. The courts just take too damn long. We need to streamline court procedures and get people through the system much more quickly. We need to look at the conditions of confinement. Some of the conditions of confinement in New York City and New York State and elsewhere are just horrific. And we can't put people into these conditions of confinement, then release them and expect them to be completely reformed. It's just naive at best. And third, we need to do a much better job of reentry and reentry programming, and start the reentry process much sooner in the release process, so that someone isn't first being consulted about reentry, a week or two before they leave, but 6 months, a year before they leave.
A question from David Love for Sergeant Montague and Professor Vitale. Does the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol provide an opportunity to address systemic racism in law enforcement and discrimination against Black police officers? Who wants to go first on that one? Alex or Vincent, whoever wants to.
Well, I was just going to say, after January 6th, like I mentioned before, that there has always been some racial tension within the police department, and I think after the election in 2016, when we had a new president, I think racial tension became really high within law enforcement, and then when we had that insurrection on January 6th, it just answered a lot of questions that we already knew, but I think it just became more public, so that people, the world could actually see what officers deal with internally. And I think Black officers actually spoke out at the Capitol of what they were dealing with internally. And things like that is real. And you do see Caucasian officers, particularly Caucasian men officers, they show more empathy to people, whether it's an insurrection, whether it's a homicide, whatever. You definitely see that, and you see the lack of empathy they show towards a Black person that could have just been arrested for a misdemeanor crime.
Have you run into the white supremacist attitudes inside your police force?
I don't want to say. I don't know if that I run across white supremacists within the police department, but I do run across people that have extreme views, and they may agree with a lot of views of people that may identify themselves as white supremacists. So I would say that, but I can't say that they're associated or they're in a white supremacist group.
Okay, Alex?
Well, thanks, David, for the question. I was glad to see you on the participant list here. So I've said a fair amount about this in an interview I did with NPR like the next day, which I just put in the chat. I don't think we're going to fix this problem by like rooting out the insurrectionists. The fact is that this is a profound political problem, and that the problem of this white supremacist violence is being funded by billionaires, is being enabled by members of Congress and the Senate, and at the time, the President of the United States. This is a political problem. I will also point out that police have always had very high representation in white supremacist and extreme right-wing organizations, from the KKK to the John Birch Society to anti-communist leagues. This has always been at the center of policing as an institution, and there are reasons for that rooted in their existence as violence workers, which is well established in the academic literature, that that's what the nature of policing is. It may not be flattering to hear that said, but that is what differentiates them from other forms of governmental intervention. And the fact that they are what's best known in the community, I think, is a sign of profound political failure, frankly. So I think it's great that we're exposing this, but this is not new, and we're going to have to fix this, I think, at a broader political level. Let's start holding people accountable for funding these QAnon websites, for funding right-wing radio talk shows, for funding QAnon candidates in Congress. Where's the accountability for the Robert Mercers and the Scaife family and these people who are getting rich off this stuff?
Here's a question that follows up a little bit on your point about violence workers. From Don Snedecor, also to Professor Vitale. Are you in favor of a European style of policing where the rank and file don't carry lethal weapons? It talks about fictional BBC TV dramas, but obviously no local example. So is it the fact that they carry arms what should not distinguish them anymore? That we should be, if they were armless or
no, I don't think the solution is to just take police officers and take their guns away. What we need to do is replace policing with nonviolent interventions in as many ways as we can possibly do that. And it turns out there are a huge number of ways to do that. So it's not a question of whether or not school counselors should have guns or school police should have guns. It's that we need to completely flip the relationship. In New York City, we have more NYPD personnel in city schools than all types of counselors combined, at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And this is just a profound political failure.
And Alex, one thing that I don't understand is, as being a police officer, is that the officers, like I said, is 23% African American that works in Cleveland, and Cleveland is well over 50% African American residents that live there. But from the insurrection, a lot of officers that are Caucasian, they support the insurrection. They support those incidents that occurred. But you have a lot of those officers. Why are they choosing to work in these urban areas? They're working around people that they don't like, that they're not familiar with, that they have no interest in. They talk about, they use racial slurs, but when they work in these areas that are affluent, they don't have those same problems, you know. And that's my issue with law enforcement. So why are we hiring people in these urban communities when you know that they don't really have an interest or care about the community?
Look, they want these jobs because they have great pay and benefits, but let's create different jobs for people. Right? Let's make the face of local government be youth workers and clinical workers and health specialists and teachers and counselors instead of uniformed armed police officers. And then that would create more jobs for people in the community rather than people from outside the, in the suburbs who want to make a lot of money working in the city and buy a nice suburban house with it.
We're just about
and I think that's part of the.
I wanted to give each of you a chance to sort of sum up. So, Richard, I was just going to go to you.
Well, I was going to go back to the Sergeant's observation. I think
Good,
this
fire
is
away on that.
I think this is a very important observation. And I think anyone that denies that there's, and nobody here is, the systemic racism in policing just doesn't know policing. It is a huge problem. And one of the problems we have, I believe, is that we don't periodically screen. We only screen new recruits. We don't periodically test or screen police officers as they work their way through their career. Police officers can develop very, very negative attitudes towards the communities they're assigned to for lots of reasons. We get into dehumanization, all of these concepts, but we have no check against it. And we need to start thinking about some way to check the mental attitude of police officers on a periodic basis, the same way we check the mental health, the attitude of police officers as we bring them into the police agency. So I'm a strong advocate for repeat screening.
Sum up a little bit about where you think the commission's ideas are going at this point.
Well, we're actually, and I'm not going to discuss this publicly, but we're actually getting good traction. We're getting a lot of interest from various people. I've been framing this as the post, what do we want police to do discussion. I think there's a broader understanding that we really need to transform the actual culture, not just try and legislate our way out of this. And some people see this as one of the ways to do that, albeit not in the short term. This is not going to happen overnight, in a longer term, but one of the ways to start fusing different skill sets, better demographics, better racial balancing as a way to get closer to communities, start to stem the tide of implicit bias, and start to reduce aggressiveness while we're doing these other things that we're all talking about, which are equally important.
One thing we didn't talk about today, and it was not intentional, was really the role of civilian oversight. I mean, whatever version of policing that we're going to have, whether it's Alex's slimmed down version, or your more forceful or more service-oriented version, or defunded version in Minneapolis, or whatever, we still don't know what role the public can and should play, and that's a question, I guess, for another panel or more research. But Vincent, do you want to give us your sum up of where you think policing is going, and then we'll end with Alex.
Okay, and thank you all for inviting me to the panel. Yeah, moving forward, I think policing is going through a huge cultural change, and it's going to, internally, I think it's going to be bad for police officers that has been embedded in this culture for years. So they're not going to like the change, because the change is going to hold officers more accountable internally. And I see that within Cleveland. Officers are getting suspended. They're getting terminated. And it's not particular officers getting it, because before in the past it might have been, if your family has been in law enforcement for 40 years, the departments might not touch you. But I see that the culture is changing to where everyone's getting it. And that's a good thing, to change in the culture. But one thing we have to do, change the culture as well up top. The mayor and the chief, the safety directors, they have to make those important decisions to let some officers go, and hiring officers, recruiting more minorities within departments. So I think the community we have to give them a bigger voice in the changes in law enforcement, because like Alex said, a lot of officers don't even live in the community. So the community needs to make more decisions on officers they want to hire, policy changes, and what policing looks like to them, because we're here to serve the community. And if we don't take what the community tells us seriously and really listen to what the community says, I don't think we can move forward with changes in law enforcement.
Thank you, Steve and Alex. Perhaps if you could sum up in 60 seconds or less.
I'll try to be quick. I think we have a chance to transform our systems. I think what we're doing isn't working. Having a standalone police department that has the culture it has is not getting us to an outcome that we want. We know that there are people in it who have attitudes that are not compatible with the future that we want. And so it's hard to imagine, community policing service models that ask people who share white supremacist views to go into community, I guess, for their betterment, and the community does the emotional work of educating them. That doesn't feel like the right approach. I think we've got an opportunity to restructure our system of policing so that armed law enforcement is working alongside as part of the city, as part of our whole city's culture, co-equal with other kinds of responders who can do other kinds of skills and bring other kinds of attitudes and ideas to the table. And I think we can shrink our reliance on armed law enforcement and increase our commitment to a more holistic system of public safety. We have those options available to us, and it's something that we need to do for everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I just think let's deeply interrogate what we've turned over to the police. If we get the police out of the drug business, out of the schools, out of the mental health business, out of a huge number of things where they are the wrong tool, turns out there's not going to be, I think, a lot left after that. And it's at that point, it's at that point that then I'm willing to have a conversation about training and culture and who we hire. But before that point, I think structurally, it's mostly irrelevant what we do here. When we turn every problem over to police, when we tell them they're at war on all these different fronts, we're going to have abusive policing and the impacts are going to be racially disproportionate. It's unavoidable. So ironically, what we might end up with is something like the British armed response units that have an extremely small mission and are very extremely tightly regulated. Every time they go on a response with a weapon, there's oversight. Anytime they use force, there's a full investigation. And so maybe that's what we could be talking about, but only after we've taken away that 50, 75% of what we've laid on them in the current system. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And
Well,
I
we may
put a
very-
little short overview of my ideas on this in the chat.
Excellent. Well, we may very well be back here next year talking about the same thing or 5 years from now. But if we do, you guys will be the first on our list to talk about it. Thank you all very much for a really absorbing conversation. These are difficult issues, and we didn't expect to get them resolved, obviously, in an hour and a half. But I hope you'll stay with us for our final panel of the day. But in the meantime, we're about 10 minutes behind schedule, which is not too bad. But we'll start in about 10 minutes at about 4:20 or so. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll take a quick break.